Welcome back everybody, my name is Tucker and today's video is a continuation of my NBA season preview series for the 2019-20 NBA season, and this one covers the Detroit Pistons. The Pistons went 41-41 last year under new head coach Dwayne Casey, which was their best record since 2016 and made only their second playoff appearance since all the way back in 2010. And that success was largely due to a healthy regular season from Blake Griffin in which he made third-team All-NBA. But the question for this team now is how do they go from a bottom-tier playoff team in the Eastern Conference to potentially bumping up and being one of the top-tier teams in the East? But first, let's go ahead and review their offseason. And first up, in terms of additions, I'm going to talk about Derrick Rose, who was one of the better stories of the year last year. His ability to come back from a couple of obviously hugely significant and devastating injuries and be a really productive and efficient NBA player for the first time really since those injuries and since he left Chicago. And if he can maintain his three-point shooting percentage from a year ago, which was one of the bigger reasons that he was so much more successful and productive, then in my opinion, he's the best point guard on this Pistons roster. Even if he doesn't get that starting spot and Reggie Jackson maintains that spot, in my opinion, he is still the best point guard on this roster at the moment. So this was a good addition for the Pistons at a relatively low price this offseason. Next up now is probably one of, if not the most interesting additions of the entire offseason, and it came recently, and that is the signing of Joe Johnson. And you don't really know what to expect from this guy because we've never had a player go from the big three, where Johnson was just the MVP, back into the NBA. Obviously, Johnson was a really productive NBA player in his prime, and then even in the later years of his career, finding ways to be a productive player. But again, expectations for him were just kind of all over the place because we've never seen something like this before, where no teams were interested in signing him at the time that he left, went to the big three, and now he's coming back. So he could be a really impactful player for this team, or he could just be an under-the-bench guy. But it's still worth it to try and bring him in and see if he can give them some help, especially once you see in the depth chart the wing rotation for this team. Next up now in terms of additions is the Pistons' first-round pick, and I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce his last name, but his first name is Sekou, obviously, as you can see at the bottom of the screen. Thankfully, I don't have to read that out, and you guys can just read it at the bottom of the screen. And he's a really interesting addition for this team because he is still just 18 and should have some progress and should be something significant for this team as a combo forward in the future, as long as he properly develops his skill. He has great physical attributes, like I said, as a combo forward, and is still so young. The only problem is skill development hasn't exactly been a hallmark of this Pistons team over the last decade or so, but maybe with the introduction now of Dwayne Casey last year, that could potentially change. But again, if he works on those skills, could be a really good project piece for this team, although probably not hugely significant for them this season. And then second to last now in terms of additions is Tony Snell, who they acquired in a trade, and he should, in theory, as long as he gets minutes on the floor and as long as he stays healthy, provide them with defense and shooting on the wing. There's really not a ton to talk about here with him. Wouldn't be surprised if he doesn't play at all, while also wouldn't be surprised if he gets like 25 minutes a game and is an important part of their wing rotation. So this was kind of an addition that they made simply because the Bucks wanted to get rid of some salary for other reasons, but could be a good addition for them again if he plays. And then last up is a free agency acquisition, and that is Markieff Morris. Now, he is someone that's going to provide them some front court scoring, some front court depth. I'm not expecting a ton from him, but he should at least be a good piece, kind of like the Rose and Johnson's additions that I already talked about as a veteran. Front court depth, a little bit of scoring as a combo forward, so a good addition here. And then in terms of subtractions, there's really not a ton to talk about. They did lose Ish Smith, who's been a good playmaking guard off the bench, or even at times a starter over the last couple of seasons in his time in Detroit. He even at times was a all-around better point guard for this team and helped them win more games than Reggie Jackson did. So they're going to miss that, but again, they brought in Rose. Shouldn't be a huge deal there. They did also lose Wayne Ellington, who obviously his ability to space the floor is something that they're definitely going to miss. And the last up is Jose Calderon, who's another playmaker, but wasn't a huge part of their team last year. So in terms of subtractions, there's really not a ton to talk about for this Pistons team. And now we move on to probably one of the most confusing parts of this entire season preview, and that is the Detroit Pistons depth chart for this upcoming season. So for me personally, I have Jackson, Kennard, Johnson, Griffin, and then Drummond as the starters. And then off the bench, you've got Rose, Galloway, Brown, Snell, Svi, Morris, and then Thon Maker as well. And the reason this is so confusing is because you can do a lot of different things at the 1 and 2 spots, which is true for basically every team across the NBA at this point. But it's especially confusing for this team because there's not that many quality options in the backcourt. When there are so many good guards in the league, it's just weird that the Pistons don't have a really top tier, even middle tier guard, unless you want to count Rose in that category. So you could certainly say that Jackson and Rose are going to start together in the backcourt, the 1 and 2. That's certainly a possibility. Or you could keep Kennard, like I have, as a shooter on the floor to create better spacing. You could even make the case that Brown should be starting to provide them even more defense. And there's just so many different options. Galloway, his role off the bench, it could be limited, it could be significant. You don't really know there. So among those 5 guys, I do at least have options, just uncertain how many of them are really high quality ones at this point outside of Rose and maybe Reggie Jackson, who I'm not a huge fan of, as you can probably tell. And then the 3 spot is all over the place as well. I mean, you could also make the case that Brown should start there, and then you bring Joe Johnson off the bench for some offense off the bench, or you could flip it around. You've also got guys like Snell and Svi that are going to be options there as well. So there's just so much chaos in this depth chart and in this rotation in the 1 through 3 spots. But thankfully, at the 4 and 5, things are pretty set in stone. You've got Griffin, you've got Drummond, you've got Maker backing up Drummond, and you've got Morris backing up Griffin. And Morris, I guess, could start at the 3 if you really wanted to go super big. Maybe those are lineups that they explore, but I wouldn't anticipate him playing the 3 a ton. But at least that front court depth and rotation is solid, and that is obviously the strength of this team. That's a part of the team that I definitely like. As long as Griffin is healthy, as long as Drummond is healthy, that's one of the better front courts in the Eastern Conference and should power them through just like it did last year and overpower certain teams. I specifically remember early in the season, the Nets, as I was watching them, had a lot of trouble with this front court, and it can still be an effective style to just be bigger and stronger and better on the glass, better as a rebounding team than other teams across the league. Can certainly still be a good strategy. And then Griffin was honestly outstanding at times from the perimeter last year, either creating shots or even knocking down threes, and that really helps their spacing because obviously that was a concern initially when he was moved to Detroit. So all of those things are good things, certainly things that I like from this Pistons team. One other thing that I will mention before I get on to some other things that I like and don't like about this Pistons team, you'll notice that Sekou the rookie is not in this depth chart, and that's only because he is so young and such a project that I'm really not expecting him to play a hugely significant role for this team this upcoming season. Even given their relatively limited depth on the wing, I would anticipate he's going to be spending a good amount of time in the G League or on the bench, and so I'm not putting him in the depth chart or in the rotation just because I don't think he's going to be a hugely impactful player this year. But like I said, let's talk about some more things that I like about this Pistons team. The only other thing other than the front court that I talked about is that at least they do have a good amount of options at the 1, 2, and 3 spots. So on a night-to-night basis throughout what's going to be a long regular season, you can just kind of ride the hot hand and play whoever is playing well, which is certainly nice. Like, you'd rather have options than not. But like I said earlier, quality is going to be an issue even when quantity isn't. When you're going into the regular season where, in my opinion, Derrick Rose, a 31-year-old Derrick Rose, is the best perimeter shot creator that you have, assuming you're not counting Blake Griffin, that's definitely going to be an issue for this team. And then things I don't like I said, the 1, 2, and 3 rotation is just kind of a mess and all over the place, which means I wouldn't be surprised at all if we saw a lot of Reggie Jackson and Derrick Rose on the floor at the same time, which should be able to create a good amount offensively, but then takes away from the offense you could bring potentially off the bench, and then would be a pretty big disaster defensively as well. Moving on now, let's talk about some players to watch. And the first one, you probably can tell I'm not a huge fan of this guy, is Reggie Jackson. And he's on here because I think it's a definite possibility that he gets traded from Detroit this season. He has an expiring contract. Even though I'm not a huge fan of him, he definitely could help a good amount of teams around the league that are pushing for the playoffs or pushing for title contention, potentially as a bench playmaker, if that's a role that he buys into. Again, as an expiring contract, does certainly have value, and that would be value that I would recommend that Detroit try and cash in on this season, because they can still push for the playoffs because they do have Derrick Rose while also getting value out of a player in Reggie Jackson that I would be surprised if they're all that excited about trying to bring back beyond this season. It was exciting initially when he got there. He has been good at times, but he's also struggled with injury issues as well as consistency, and so he would be better served to play probably a reserve role, a 6-man role for another team. And again, the Pistons would be wise to capitalize on that value, not only on the court, but as well as an expiring contract. And then the other player to watch, this probably isn't all that surprising given that there's not a ton of interesting names to talk about on this Pistons team, and it's going to be Luke Kennard. And all of his per game averages last year, almost all of them went up, which makes sense. He got more minutes and things like that, but his efficiency also dropped off a bit, which again, isn't all that surprising given the fact that this is a second-year player that took on a little bit more responsibility, but ended up playing in less games because of some injury issues, and again, his efficiency dropped. Not a huge deal, certainly something to be expected, but really the reason that he's here and the reason that I would keep an eye on Kennard is we know that he's a good shooter, but if he's going to be anything else in the NBA, this is probably the year that we're going to find out, because he's going to have plenty of opportunities to play, to be a big part of this team, to be a good scorer for this team. And again, if he's going to turn into anything other than just a shooting specialist, then we're probably going to find out this year if he's going to be a shooter, if he's going to be a shot creator, or again, if that's all he's going to do, if he's going to be a scorer, if he's going to be a shot creator, then we're going to find out. Otherwise, he's just going to be a shooting specialist. There's nothing wrong with that. Again, it's just a reason to keep an eye on him, a reason to keep an eye on this team as a whole is the potential progress of Luke Kennard. Moving on now, let's talk about some expectations. I think it's fair to expect the Detroit Pistons to compete for a playoff spot this season, but for me personally, I don't have them in the playoffs. I've got them between 36 to 40 wins, so certainly in contention for the 8th seed in the Eastern Conference, but ultimately there are just 8 teams that I like better. I don't love the perimeter talent on this team. Obviously, Griffin and Drummond, as long as they are healthy, should be very good, but I also think there's a possibility, again, for another injury-riddled season for Blake Griffin, like we've seen in a lot of other ones prior to the one that we just saw. That's definitely a possibility that could just completely torpedo their season and then potentially result in a Reggie Jackson trade like I talked about earlier. But again, this is a common thing. People love to bring up, oh, the Eastern Conference is weak, especially at the back end. But even though it's weaker than the West, there are still some really good teams competing for those 6 through 8 seeds, in my opinion. Teams like the Raptors, teams like the Magic, teams like the Heat, potentially the Nets if they fall back that far into the standings. And I just like those teams better, in my opinion, than the Detroit Pistons. Nothing against them. They should at least be a solid team, but I don't have them personally in the Eastern Conference playoffs in terms of my own predictions. But that is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then please be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.